Thank you for the invitation. First of all, I'm very glad to be here and to be talking to you guys. So I have been I'm a mathematician by training, and I have a lot of interest over the past years over personal data and its uses in many different ways, commercial uses, political uses, and everything. I've come to international prominence around the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where working with Carole, Cadwalladr, the journalist that's trying to get in, but many other people as well, we have been uncovering this whole scandal around the use of data by political actors to influence public opinions in the context of Brexit and the US elections in 2016. And so now I have well, internalized some of the learnings from all of that, and I'm trying to build a company that is focused on building more sustainable data solutions. So that's kind of the catchphrase. But in that context, working on a particularly interesting project of data collectives. But I think we will talk more about that in a tiny bit. And Carole is struggling to figure it out with people.
Yes, we're sending her alternative entry requirements. But one of the things that recently I was at the press conference of HestiaLabs, and you're showcasing some of the projects that are working. And the one that you suggested talking about and that I was really interested in was is it Millionize or
Millionize is a good name as well. It's called the eyeballs.
the eyeballs, the eyeballs, yeah.
Yes.
But particularly because it's like this is a very tangible thing that people can actually use. I don't know if it's consumer ready yet or if it's early access and stuff, but would you be able to give like a quick description on that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two ways to describe it. One is like coming from describing the overall project. So the overall project is to build what we call data collectives. So groups of people who get together to use their personal data to get value out of it that they would not otherwise get in the current economic environment around personal data. So if you're really truly actor of your own data and you're able to like to decide how that resource is being used, you should be able to get more than what you currently get. So that's the very abstract way. And then we got funding to work on 5 different use cases. And one of them is the eyeballs. And so that's the other angle to describe, is to just say, well, there's this thing called the eyeballs. And what does the eyeballs do? Well, it's investigating, it's a citizen initiative investigating the attention economy. So how our attention is being monetized everywhere, how profiles are being built about us, and how that infrastructure is being leveraged to sell us stuff, but also sometimes to
Okay.
yes. So there is a link to that. And what is this? Well, there's 2 steps to it. The first step is a literacy step, like helping people understand how their data is being used, what can be done with it, all of that stuff. So this is really very much aligned with resilience in a sense. And that is kind of actionable already. If you go to the site, you will get different tools that you can use. One of our tools is it's an extension, you install it, and whenever you go on a news website or on a site with advertisements, it will tell you how much that advertisement costs to show. And this price will be different, you'll see, on disinformation websites, on more classic established websites. So that's the beginning of an awareness around those issues. Another tool we build is a subject access request tool. So the GDPR, the data protection regulations in Europe, give you rights to access your data. So we know of a lot of actors who probably have data about you, about the participants here. And it's just a matter of knowing how to exercise your rights to gain access to that data. And so we facilitate that. And then another one is a tool to visualize your data. So some platforms, especially Twitter more than Facebook, are quite transparent about how targeting works. or relatively transparent about how targeting works, in the sense that you can go and you can download your data from a portal that they've set up, and you will get raw information about how that targeting, or at least its outcome. And so what we do is we take this raw data and we present it differently, so that it can serve as well as a literacy tool to understand, like, okay, I've received, this many advertisements, and I've received them because they were targeted based on those criteria, right? So the idea is to really inform people about this point of monetization of their attention, essentially. And that's just, I said there was 2 steps. So that's just the first step. That's the literacy step. But the goal is to, and I think that that's going to work, because the goal is to mutualize that information so we can actually go further and do research. So it's extremely natural in the workshops we have run that people look at their own data, they're interested, they're curious. Of course, it's not the general public either. It's like people willing to attend such a workshop, but they're very curious, and immediately they go into this mode of, one, comparing to each other. Is my neighbor getting something different? Like, how do I relate to my neighbor? And then the second step is even more impressive, a step of scientific, rational thought around this situation, because they start formulating hypotheses of, I'm being targeted because of this. I'm being targeted in this way because I'm a man, because I'm a woman, because I use Android, because I use, all of those things, because I looked at that website, etc. So they formulate hypotheses, and then they start to try testing it from whatever they have at disposal. So I think that's a really, really encouraging development. And of course, that step of mutualizing the information, of going towards the more rational, research-oriented approach, that's only possible if we have good governance structures. And that's how we circle back to this idea of data collectives. If we have good ways of caring for that resource that is the data here, underlying all of this targeting.
Okay, thank you for those comments, Paul. And now we have Carole joining us in the room. Welcome, Carole.
Hi, I'm sorry I was late.
No worries, no worries. But yeah, but like, I think you didn't hear all of Paul's introduction, but I think it serves as like, I'm going to try to engineer a swift pivot in our discussion and trying to point all of these kind of concepts back to our idea theme of the day about preserving democracy. So.
Maybe Carole can tell you about the citizens, and then we can tell you about how the citizens and the eyeballs are starting to work together.
Oh, okay. Is citizen something new? Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's start with that and then see where we go. I have some other let's go with the flow, and if I notice people logging off or whatever, I'll try to ask some focusing questions and we'll see. But I think we're going to have an informative, fun next almost hour or so. So, Carole, what's the citizens? And
Thanks, Esco. And it's such a shame that we're not in person. It's really not the same, is it, doing these things on Zoom? But anyway, so the citizens, basically, it came out of the Cambridge Analytica investigation that I did for the Guardian. And, in many respects, that investigation became much more sort of impactful than, one could ever hope for from journalism, in that there was, all of these official investigations which launched, and there were actual massive, regulators got involved, and there were huge fines issued from, things like the FTC fining Facebook $5 billion. But ultimately, it didn't change anything at all. And nobody got held to account for anything. And meanwhile, the problem is sort of like going on and getting worse. So it really just made me sort of think hard about the way that the sort of the nature of the media landscape now, and really how how one can operate as a journalist in it when we're in this age of shamelessness, when everybody gets away with everything and it no longer works to slap the big story on the front page of any newspaper. And so really, I think the thing that sort of through this that I came to, and it's a sort of similar conclusion to Paul, which is this: you need more people on it. So it's you need to sort of boost, you sort of need to boost the forces of journalism. You need to do journalism differently. You need to do it more creatively. You need to tell it to, you know, different audiences. And just basically you have to find sort of ways of engaging people in it. And that's where I sort of feel that it's only through that thing of changing public sentiment around these things that, you know, you're going to get any kind of accountability. And so the Citizens is, I refer to it as the media organization that I set up by mistake. So it was, I had some idea for it, and then the pandemic struck, and the British government decided that they were going to try and kill us all, and they're doing pretty effectively at that. And so it was kind of as a result of that, we sort of just launched sort of some different projects. And we've got ambitions to do sort of more things, including data investigations. But as yet, we're sort of, you know, we're tiny startup organization, and just like merely surviving has been as much as anybody can hope to do for the last two years. But yes, but what Paul is referring to, I think, is this, I think right at the very start, we'd had this idea. In fact, I think the first thing we thought about, Paul, I think we had a conversation with you about Clearview AI, didn't we? And it was this idea of like, well, actually, like, so if we could do this, if we could, you know, using Paul's idea of using data tools, of getting a sort of mass, we had an idea. I tell you what the idea was, we never got around to it, which was that we were going to launch something called Faceback. And it was going to be trying to get people to get their face back from Clearview AI. And so this idea of involving people in sort of like mass SAR requests, finding out what sort of information that gives us, hoping there's sort of journalistic articles to come from that, and potentially even kind of legal challenges. But using, you know, it's everything's about this thing of, you know, finding sort of like new and interesting ways to tell the story, really. Because, you know, I sort of think with so many of these sort of threats we can see sort of across the range with democracy, it's that, you know, we kind of know the facts, but nonetheless they're not getting, you know, that it's not getting through to people sufficiently to kind of do anything about it. So yeah, so it's that. And, you know, with Cambridge Analytica, that was exactly the same thing. With Cambridge Analytica, we actually, like, when I so-called broke the story, it was actually all the facts were already out there, you know. Harry Davies broke the original story back in 2015, but it didn't make any difference, and Facebook didn't answer the questions. And then Paul was digging away on it, and, you know, Hannes Grassedger wrote a great story, and The Intercept did. All the facts were kind of out there, but it was actually finding, you know, for me, it was like getting the human source who could talk to them, and the sort of documentation. And I think, you know, you see that again at the moment, I think, with Frances Haugen, don't you? A lot of the facts are already out there. We knew this stuff, but it was that she brought this different way of sort of telling that story, and so it has more impact. Does that make any sense? Sorry, I feel like...
and I think if like have some cause for optimism. In the past few weeks in Britain, the kind of MP second jobs story, it seemed like we've always known, it's not been a secret.
Exactly.
But now for some reason, a confluence of different factors means people care, and there's momentum building up, and there could potentially be a change afoot because the body of opinion. But I think that's an interesting question about like mobilizing collectives. And things like the last time we were in the same room, there was a brief discussion about like, how do we build Paul's army, you know, and I was talking about my experience as I know what the structure of participation in a military organization and how you take people with no skills and bring them up. Never really did anything about it, but we're seeing that now, like with the investigative journalist consortiums, with is not Panama Papers, Pandora is the latest release, with when many people get the bug about the same thing and have some kind of coordinated approach, then we see the possibility for it. And whereas in the past, maybe that would have been on a political spectrum basis, like let's mobilize the left and the workers and stuff. Now maybe we can be a bit more granular and focus on, here is an egregious affront to democracy. We have the evidence, we have the data, we have the thing, but we don't have the mobilization. So picking things one off at a time. I don't know.
Well, I think maybe it helps to also say that one of the other collectives, remember there were 5 verticals, another one is Uber drivers, who would be this army of people exercising their subject access request rights. So SAR, a SARmy, that's what we were talking about, SAR army. So if all those drivers were to reclaim their data from Uber, then they could get a better sense of their environment when they use the platform, of the decisions that are taken, all of that. And that organizing, from the outside, it looks very much like classic labor organizations alignments, but the reality is much more complex. This sort of digitalization of labor unions is far from obvious because the structures of power around this data don't map the classical structures of power that are most natural offline, let's say. So, yep.
Can we kind of float towards the, so when we last met, it was this in Helsinki, MyData conference, the screening of the My Hack, the Great Hack documentary you both feature in, and as pertains threats to democracy, the proposition is that some people that we bite, I don't know, Carole, you didn't see the previous speaker, Linda Boss, who's done some studies on the political intolerance of populism, who pointed out that populism itself is actually a neutral set of criteria. It can be on the left or on the right. So wherever you are on the spectrum, your enemies can be the populist, but the same kind of criteria can be applied at your end. So we can characterize a general sense that the bad people, the ones like, if you're not for Brexit, for example, leveraged new technologies and psychological warfare techniques in conjunction with this attack surface provided by the social network platforms of Facebook, who generated some of the data that could be exploited in and of themselves. And that was kind of new, you know, like shaping opinions in populations using these kind of techniques and devices and resources that they have also. So in that time period, you know, what have we learned about how can we defend ourselves and be resilient? I don't think is the answer like everybody needs to leave Facebook, or like, is that realistic? Is that what have we learned from that? And if today we're going to start the job of defending against you know, our democracy, what do we know? How are we better equipped to do that then? At that time?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really interesting questions. I mean, it's kind of interesting because in Britain, I think, you know, where we, you know, we kind of gradually unpeeled all of these problems. Like, I think, you know, in 2016, we were all incredibly, I certainly was incredibly naive in that elections, you know, were the same as they'd ever been, in that you go up to a polling station and with a pencil you tick a box and you cast your vote. And in this is, you know, as time immemorial. But actually what had changed is that the entire, you know, landscape around elections and how they were conducted and where money was spent and how campaigning was done had completely changed. And you know, it sort of transpired that you know, that every sort of law and protection and rule we had in place to protect the integrity of our elections just didn't work anymore. I mean, they just don't work anymore. So, you know, there is just no safeguards whatsoever. You know, in Britain, I think you have two sort of, you know, strict spending laws. So it's this idea that, you know, there's nobody can just, you know, a billionaire can't just come in and just throw money around, and that sort of, you know, we've had this like this idea of a level playing field. And essentially what the platforms opened up is the possibility that sort of anybody could spend any amount of money campaigning and nobody would know, and nobody would know what anybody else had seen, and there was going to be no record, there's no trace of it, there's nothing you can research afterwards. And we do now understand that, you know, a lot more about that and what happened, and absolutely nothing has been done about it here. So, you know, there's been, you know, sort of parliamentary committees have said, you know, we urgently need to reform this, and we need new protections, and we need new laws, and, you know, it simply hasn't happened here. And so I think we're in this, you know, we're now in this era where we understand quite a lot more about the risks of the harms and how vulnerable we are. And vulnerable, that is, to foreign states who can also do these things, but also just to, like, you know, domestically, you have enough people who've got enough invested to sort of like act badly. And so we're now in this situation where we understand that and can see that, and we've done nothing about it. So it's resting, I suppose, on a few people like yourself and the people you've got coming to your events to be the sort of ones at the edge of sort of trying to raise the alarm with other people about that. And, you know, it's still very, very poorly understood. I think it's only a tiny fraction of people have, it's still, you know, the mainstream reporting of it is still very poor, it's very weak. In Britain, we've just now got our first disinformation correspondent. The BBC has got somebody now, and so that's great. So there's like much more now in the mainstream, but it's still only one person on one channel. So yes, sorry.
I think I want to bounce on this because, so of course the problem is super complex, and also it requires coordinated action by many people, and complex actions by many people to address. So one crucial factor is which subgroups of people can act fast and efficiently and beneficially together on those complex problems. So one intense focus for me is also to think about culture and the vocabulary that people use. So Esko in his question, because the culture, the vocabulary helps a lot of people work together much faster. So Esko in his question, for instance, asked about attack surface. And attack surface is a very complex thing to already integrate, think about. To this audience, it makes sense, I presume, because he used it. So if we think of social media as an attack surface, like he was doing, what's the exact problem? Well, the problem is that social media or the big companies have commercialized the capacity for any actor in a peer-to-peer way, essentially, to exploit a really vast attack surface on any one of us in a very personalized way. So if you think in terms of risk to individuals, it's like we have this massive power of capitalism, let's say, lots of money inputs into building a personalized attack surface on you, on anyone. And that's a problem, obviously. So what's the response to that? Well, the first answer of a security expert would be, we need to map out this attack surface. But so that would amount to mapping out the tools that Facebook puts at disposal of others, the ways that targeting can happen. We could make a coordinated effort of mapping those tools, but it's not sufficient because it's really about personalization. The risks are personalized. All of that stuff is really personalized. And that's where institutions have a real problem to address this. It's because the risk, there are big institutions thinking about that, but it has to be made relatable to the individual. So these attack surfaces have to be investigated by individuals and have to be explained to general public from that individual's viewpoint, not in the abstract. What does it mean that Facebook can target me with a lookalike audience, for instance? What are the risks to me of that? To me as a person who has a disability that might be concerned about insurance exploiting that. To me as someone who has children and somehow that might be valuable to the commercial sphere. To me, who has beliefs different from my neighbors that I consider to be extreme, and that might influence my neighbors, might influence me in some way or another for different reasons. And so that step of like embedding the understanding of the attack surface into an individual is something institutions cannot do, and the existing institutions. And this is where people like in this forum, I presume, can sort of change hat and think, hey, I'm also a general person. I'm also someone from the public. I'm also potentially affected by this. I'll map out my own attack surface so that I can tell my own story about that attack surface. And from there, found links to a broader public than my own subculture, in a sense, so that I can radiate my understanding from there. I don't know if that makes sense, but what I'm trying to do in the explanation is also leverage words that carry a huge amount of meaning to a specific subcommunity in order to mobilize them faster into specific attack response patterns.
I think it does. We started the day watching some Timothy Snyder videos, and one of his rules of resistance is be kind to the language. And I think I'm super guilty of very loosely using language and assuming people understand what I mean. I think as I was listening to you, and I want to bring it back to Carole now, but we're discussing a couple of different asymmetries of power, like very well resourced, large institutions, technologically capable, and individuals. And I've witnessed a variety of responses on an individual level, kind of in the Brexit context, and now we've been talking to Eastern Europeans, like Ukrainians, trying to find democracy under conditions of hybrid war, and from one end there's like total apathy. Like I go to the pub on Friday and have my pint and watch my EastEnders and nothing's wrong and I don't care. To, oh, now there's not food, the food that there used to be available in the shop, and I'm starting to care about it, but really it's not like, I'll go to the other shop. To head in the sand, like it's strategy saying like, I'm going to ignore it and wait until it all goes away. To that's somebody else's problem to do, to now this has affected my life to a point I'm really pissed off and I want to do something about it, but I don't know how. Those are potential recruits for, I think what you're talking about, Paul. And Carole, your experience has been kind of at personal risk. The Ukrainians we've talked to, their siblings have been killed in the war. You have been got at by some of these power, I won't name names and things like that, and I'm not sure what the legal status of things, but at personal risk and cost, your journalism has kind of brought you into trouble. How can we encourage people, like, this is worth doing, it's if you don't do anything, someday you wake up and you don't have that democracy anymore. Some people voted for Hitler in the 30s because he said, I'll put bread on the table, and that seemed plausible, and nobody else had an answer to that. They never got another election. Like, that was it.
Yeah. I think as well, we're sort of like, I think what's so difficult at the moment is we're operating in two time scales. So for all of us, we're still on our, human, normal, analog time scale, which is that we remember 5 years ago and 10 years ago, and essentially we're still wearing the same T-shirt we had 5 years ago. It's kind of, these things. But in that 5 years, the pace of technological change, it's doubled and it's doubled and it's doubled and it's doubled. And so I do think it's just, there's a real problem with, our kind of perceptive faculties, is that we cannot understand how insanely fast this world, online world, is changing. And the fact is that the people who are in charge of that are, three white men in Silicon Valley with kind of right-wing libertarian values, and that's being encoded in this, technology, which is going to, dominate our lives and everybody else's lives in the years to come. And so I think one of the kind of key things is that, like in the way that you're talking about Hitler and Timothy Snyder, and there's that very famous quote: first they came for the, what is it? First they came for the dissidents, and I wasn't a dissident, so I didn't speak out. Blah, blah. And I think that's why it's just so important at the moment is to be like listening to the people who are at the sort of like front end of being harmed by this technology, and sort of like seeing where it leads. And we haven't done enough of that. The fact that the United Nations implicated Facebook directly in the incitement of a genocide in Myanmar. And most people don't even know about that. It's never, we haven't really understood that story. We don't understand that impact for us. And I guess the kind of, I think the position that I found myself in for the last sort of, from when I kind of stumbled into this world in December 2016, was that thing of just, of sort of feeling that sort of like I've been plunged into this, felt like, sort of sci-fi world, but it was actually real, and needing to sort of like sound the alarm about it, because, this is all happening. It's invisible to us. We can't see it. And that's why it's, it's so difficult to sort of storytell around it. And so that's why different interventions like Paul, the thing of like trying to make this data visible so that, you can sort of track it and understand it, that's a sort of grassroots intervention. Other ways, like I say, of like trying to tell better stories around it, that's another route. But yeah, I sort of, I think there's been a little bit of a hiatus. I think the sort of like the very present threat of Trump kind of concentrated everybody's minds for a sort of couple of years. And now that has receded, briefly, essentially. And so there's been a bit of a kind of, this is my sense, maybe you completely disagree, there's been a bit of a sigh of relief of kind of like, okay, yeah, the world's not ending. There's somebody's going to do some regulation. There'll be some legislation. It's probably going to be okay. But I kind of think there's lots of reasons for thinking that actually it might not be. But sorry, is that too?
No, that's great. And like, I think the Americans are sighing a breath of relief, and it's quite clear that he will try to come back, but maybe the Poles and the Hungarians aren't so much. We'll later hear from Anastasia Apetek, who's a Ukrainian lawyer, and we were before the conference we were discussing how like we can be on trajectories in different directions. Some people have the democracy and take it for granted, and things are happening that is gradually eroding that, and other people are fighting really hard for the privilege of having it. And when we say fighting, it's like on the front lines with bullets.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's kind of funny. A friend sent me an article this morning just about just sort of, about the Kiev Post. So which has been this independent, it's English language independent newspaper, which has been in Ukraine for 26 years. And, it's kind of, I sort of, I witnessed, it was a friend of a friend who set it up. I kind of like, it was this sort of amazing moment, Ukraine getting some independent, and now, it's on this, that trajectory sort of turns downward. And so, yeah, I think that sort of understanding the fragility of all of these things is, of democracy itself is super important. And so, Esko, well done for this is very impressive that you've organised this to think about all those issues. I'm glad that somebody's thinking about it.
We have to start somewhere. Can I draw our attention to the questions? And there's one here. I'm gathering that this is from a local politician who's been hacked on Facebook and locked out of Facebook. Has no idea how to even raise an issue about this. So, fighting the monster, how do I get my Facebook back? Being a local politician, it's even reducing my impact to ability to work fully. What do I do?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of insane, isn't it? I mean, that's just that is literally, nuts. That, that this is a situation which so many people find themselves in. And, you know, it's a monolithic private company from which you have no rights, no right of appeal, no access to a person to even ask about this. I mean, you know, that's a really, you know, powerful demonstration of why, you know, that the unaccountability of the tech platforms is, you know, one of the sort of key facets in this whole picture. And that, so, you know, I've got, again, what's come out of my, you know, come out of the Cambridge Analytica investigation is that we run this project now called the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which was, and it's sort of, it's trying to get to, you know, trying to sort of highlight exactly that kind of problem, because, you know, it's preposterous that we're in this situation, and we shouldn't be, and we've got to find ways to resist it. And, you know, as I sort of said, is I kind of was in this situation where journalism, even though it was, you know, I really feel that, like, in many respects, journalism is doing its job. It's surfacing these stories, it's publishing it, it's drawing attention, and yet it doesn't work in the kind of like way that we sort of, you know, think that it should work or used to work. So yeah, so I mean, it's, what I'm trying to do now is that I don't know if this works either, but it's a kind of performative style journalism, which is, so we brought together the civil rights groups in America, the Colour of Change and the NAACP, and brought them together with these sort of tech scholars and critics to kind of sort of at least speak with a collective voice around these issues, and essentially it operates as a sort of counter disinformation unit to Facebook is the idea. But it's, you know, it's, you know, we're sort of pissing in the wind, basically. It's that, you know, that Facebook has armies of lobbyists and armies of press people and, you know, all the money. So, yeah, these are really, really intractable problems. But I think that's a, if Emily's a politician, you know, I hope that he gets some other journalist to write a story about that.
So that's one, like, I'm thinking of practical things, power asymmetry, no chance one local politician gets anything out of Facebook, but what are the like, add the case study to a portfolio of case studies that builds up a bigger thing, go to the European Commission. I know that they're considering kind of sanctions against Facebook for the, like, what can a person practically, who do they tell? Do they call you, or is there like some journalist group that's doing those kind of stories?
I think if Emily's a politician, I think you should try and get this onto the front page of a newspaper. I think, okay. You know, it's sort of like, this is exactly, you know, and it'd be kind of interesting to consult a local lawyer on it as well. Is that, as I said, is his ability to actually participate in politics, public life is being completely prohibited. It's
But the problem is not that Facebook has excluded that person. The problem is that a precondition for public life is Facebook. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So addressing the individual need of going back on the platform so that they can participate doesn't really solve the problem, the underlying problem.
But it highlights, it's like, at least it sort of shows people why it's a problem and why they need to care about it. And that's got to be the first stage, isn't it?
Yes, but the natural trend, so I say that because the natural trend of a lot of people involved is to say, what can we do to help this person? No, it's actually, what can we do to help each other or help all of us in the face of this huge threat towards us, essentially, this huge attack surface that we all have. How do we face it together? It's not just one person. Also, because in that case, it's a very binary thing, it seems. It's whether that person has access or not. But the reality of a lot of those threats is that they're much more gradual. It's like, what's your coefficient of amplification that you get from Facebook? That coefficient could go from 0 to 1, right? It could be like, let's say, it could be that Facebook just...
Or they're getting technical, just interrupt you there. Just saying.
Yeah, so well, coefficient of amplification, I just imagine this is an abstract thing, but like, how much boost does Facebook give content, right? So it could say that for that particular politician, it gives no boost whatsoever. that means they can still go on Facebook, they can still post stuff, they can still, like, it looks to them like it's completely normal, but the content is never shown to anyone else, right? Or they could give the Trump treatment and just swamp everyone with that information. So my point is that it's not a binary thing. It's not like, oh, that person has a problem with Facebook and that person doesn't. If you think of it like that, you've already lost it, because it's a very gradual thing. We're all affected. We don't know exactly how, and we have to see this as a collective problem. Otherwise, we're all sliding towards more control to Facebook, essentially. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, well, it did when Carole interrupted the mathematician in you with your coefficients, but
I've done that. It's my role with Paul.
Yeah. He can translate nerds to you, and you can translate him to people.
I said, what are you trying to say in human, Paul? Is
so, like, going back to our theme, that one, we're trying to learn about these threats. I think we're doing well, and two, we're trying to figure out practical things that we can do. So for Emily, I know there's some people in this call now who are from the MyData community, like interested and based in Finland and stuff. I presume, I don't know where you're from, but if it's in Finland. So there's a practical thing. Let's get that story in Helsingin Sanomat and figure out how we can do that so that at least it's not contained within our little thing, but the awareness of these kinds of threats start widening out. So my father.
Can I suggest, so instead of aiming for Helsingin Sanomat, why not aim for like the former Norwegian Prime Minister, I think, who posted a picture of this napalm event in Vietnam with a naked child, and their picture on Facebook was removed. So that created a lot of buzz at the time, because it was, a newspaper article, a politician of let's say higher level that got their freedom to participate in public life was restricted by Facebook. Why not get some other names, some other big names that have been involved in this, and try to coordinate that have been involved in similar situation, and try to coordinate a response amongst them. Not just so connecting globally, because those problems are not local in a sense.
Paul, you've been thinking about practical responses for, I think you're way ahead of the game than many of us in here. I don't know what your plans tomorrow, but I hope you consider joining our dialogue session where we do that. I don't want to hold you, don't have to answer that. I moved to the comments. So my father's shown up in the comments with the point that, like, in the 30s, the choices were fascism, communism, democracy, and makes the point that now actually interests are far more atomized. You can find your little niche of interest somewhere on the internet, spend your whole life there oblivious about everything else that's going on. And the question is, can we mobilize people for a general cause again? I think my journey is into the systems innovation and systems change world are kind of asking those questions. Given that we're so atomized, how do we rediscover the connections between things? And in our thematic choices, we put things into boxes and then very quickly realize they're all connected to each other and they feed to each other. So the question is, can we mobilize people for a general cause? And while I'm throwing questions in there, this might be for Paul. Can the GDPR be manipulated to protect those who hold the data from releasing it to the people that the data is about? I think you might have a quick answer, but can we comment on that? Like, are we able to mobilize for general causes encompassing many diverse groups, or are we too atomized now and we've got to go and tackle this niche interests individually with their own language and in ways that they respond?
I don't feel very equipped to answer this. I mean, I think it's is this, I mean, we know, I guess, that sort of identity politics is sort of becoming more and more of a thing, isn't it? Which seems to be, is that perhaps what that sort of question's about slightly? Like, how do we sort of move people beyond that into like broader thematics? Is that the kind of question?
Yeah, I think so.
I think I'm the best person. I think people here are much better equipped to answer that than I am, personally.
The question is also about the fact that if you go on the internet, you can find something to suck your attention very effectively in a positive way, like something you're passionate about. You can do it with your small community, etc., which allows you to just ignore everything else that's going around you. So how do we mobilize lots of people in this given the situation that everyone has their micro interest that they care about more, essentially? And I think that's an excellent question.
I do as well, I suppose, in sort of like part of that. You know, there a lot of people who know about these subjects had found the documentary The Social Dilemma very annoying for lots of reasons, but it was really effective in sort of, nonetheless it sort of spoke, especially to a younger audience, just around the sort of, apart from anything else, the addictive qualities of this technology and how it's been so, you know, designed by the sort of, you know, some of the smartest people around to be addictive. And how the other thing I thought it expressed well was this idea that we are all of us in this sort of experiment at the moment where all of our brains are sort of linked together. We're all reacting off each other. And we are, you know, we are being rewired in ways which we don't really understand and feel very helpless about. I mean, I certainly do. I'm a terrible scroller. You know, the way that these things are designed, that you can't read the end of the internet. There's always more of it. And yes,
my wife is convinced I have, because
your brain's been rewired.
No, that I have read the end of the internet. She always tells me that the most obscure thing I know, because indeed I also spend a lot of time online. So yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's good. It's good to know that you've read it all, Paul. I feel like, yeah.
You heard it here first. We found the guy who's read the whole internet.
I mean, yeah. No, she's wrong, but yeah. Nevertheless, she thinks I have. But I think the answer that I have to this is kind of going in the same direction, but with maybe a more concrete example. Same direction as what Carole was saying is we need to reconnect with universal stories. In a sense, we can reconnect with each other through universal stories, and those universal stories, even though they have, for instance, addiction of children to social media, even though they have underlying technical causes, that doesn't need to be put first in the story. So that's a really important element, is like those universal stories around global technology. And I have one example in mind in particular. It's this story written for The Guardian by Judith Duportail about Tinder. And I helped her get her data back from Tinder. And in the end, it wasn't that juicy data in a sense. Like, it was just her exchanges, things that she knew she had given to Tinder. She knew Tinder had it. But the article that she wrote, and I really encourage everyone to read it. Maybe someone can post it in the comments now. First of all, it touches a universal story, right? It's like, how do you connect effectively with others? But she told it from a standpoint of, here is the raw resource that they're using, and let me fantasize about how it could be used for good or bad. Like, she wasn't explicit that this was the frame of her article, but that's the way she wrote it. And that I mean, Carole gave me that feedback afterwards, that article had enormous resonance, actually, with lots of people. And it's a story about technology, but told in a way that is truly universal.
Yeah, no, it was one of it came up, I think, didn't it? It was one of the most read articles on the Guardian site that year, I think.
Yeah, so what happened is the Guardian editor picked it 6 months later as the example of the type of stories around data that worked really well. I think that's what happened to share with journalists. So just to show that it stood out, basically.
Well, actually, you know, Paul, and the thing I sort of like often quote is that I did this event with this really early on when I started reporting this stuff, with this journalist who had been she'd been sort of like one of the first sort of technology reporters in the 80s. And she said she was, you know, this was before the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And she just sort of said, you know, my editor, she said this word, she said this word data is so, you know, it's so problematic. It's so boring, it's so dry, people don't understand it. And my editor was just like, you've just got to think of it, this is naked photographs of yourself. And that's what you've got to kind of like tell readers. This is, and I you know, I kind of always tell a lot because, and I think that's what the Tinder story sort of like, you know, I think gave people that sort of creepiness really of this idea, this sort of personal information is out, you know, about you, and how could that be used?
Well, but creepiness, but also, I mean, creepiness when it's applied to you, but also kind of curiosity when applied to others. I mean, this is a 30-something woman writing about her sex life as understood by Tinder. So there is definitely an angle where the reader is also intrusive and curious reading about that, right? So all of that together worked pretty well around that article.
I think there's so I know, Paul, you've been working a lot with journalists because you deal in technical, you know, in legalistic and technical concepts that are inaccessible to most people, and journalists can tell the stories about those. And I think going beyond a bit, just that, you know, the Facebook, like, we have rights in Europe to get our data back from companies, but often what you'll get is 150 pages of JSON. What the hell? I have no idea what this stuff is, or how to use it, or what story it tells, or what it is. So this kind of, I think one of the challenges or tricks or things we need to address earlier on is this intermediation. Later we have a session with Valdis Krebs, who's kind of my mentor in learning about network analysis. By the way, Carole, while we're here, I think he's interested in collaborating with you. So there might be an email coming after, and I'll say that. Sorry, doing the public linen out there. But he's so when you're in a situation, you think like, oh, erosion of institution, I care about this, I want to do something, I don't have a legal background, I don't have the tools to do that, or how is Facebook connected to these populist tendencies and that messaging and these web of networks. So he is offering practical ways of drawing the networks between those as a preliminary step for the storytelling of the situation. Some time ago, he mapped the relationships between the Trump kind of circle and Putin. And I commented, and he showed it publicly, and I commented to him, like, when you get people like Steve Bannon in there and stuff, saying, you're 1 degree away from Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore and all of, like, the Brexit cluster. 1 degree of separation from all of these things. It's just if you ask that question, those questions, you would do that. But I think that's kind of like a fruitful way. Like, how do we get people from being bewildered to saying, now I've got one thing I can do which gets me a little bit closer to being a functional activist against the thing that I care about.
So I think you started a question that you didn't finish, but I think it's really important to finish it actually for activists to understand.
Please complete it.
So the yes, what I do is very technical. Yes, I work with many journalists. So it's really important to understand that in a space where there is micro harms, micro damage, even sometimes speculative, this will require a completely different way of approaching that societal cost. So if you can't spend your time telling about this potential mini risk and investing a huge amount of money in doing this, a huge amount of your time and money in doing this. It will not be a good return on investment. So it also means that to highlight the harms to the whole chain of like understanding the problem, documenting it, thinking of how to tell that story, etc., has to be completely rethought. Also through a monetary lens, or through a financial lens, because otherwise, you know, it's just too much investment of effort to make people aware of the problem. So the consequence there is that I've realized it takes a huge amount of time to tell a story, to tell it well. It takes a huge amount of resources, for instance, legal resources behind you to be able to back you up. So I've decided that I was not the one telling the story, right? There are professionals at this and they are called journalists. So if the story is interesting, if you can if the potential story is interesting, if you have all the data and all the information needed to write about it, they'll gladly write about it. And you should accept that it's not always the story you would have told, but they know better in general, and that can be a very productive way of working with them. But that requires is really scaffolding the whole thing. So you have to understand that the journalist is seeking to produce more knowledge in the general public. At least that's the way I see it. But the journalist needs information, not raw data, like you were pointing out, Esko, not raw data in order to be able to write his story or his or her story. So for instance, with Carole, I helped her recover her insurance data that Aaron Banks somehow had and was using to target ads, right? So this was very raw at first, but then I had to explain it to her. So this became sort of common information between us. We understood both it from a rather dry standpoint, but then she told a story about it. And now this has become more widespread knowledge that this data, this car insurance data, was used in the context of the Brexit referendum. And this scaffolding is necessary because, and it's different actors that are involved, mostly for financial reasons, I think, because it's just not realistic to pretend covering all of what has been uncovered, and one has to be strategic, and this requires a huge amount of resources.
Well, Paul, as well, though, you are an example of a citizen researcher in the sense of that, like that's in the sense of like how you got involved with this stuff and had such impact was because you when I first met Paul, he'd done this amazing document of research on Cambridge Analytica. And I just started looking into the company, and Paul had made this document public. Like anybody could access it, and it just had this like wealth of like highly researched information there. And he'd just done this, and I sort of said to Paul, I was like, this is kind of amazing, but how come? What's going on? And Paul, you were like, other people have hobbies. Mine is a very strange one. You were like, it's like a hobby, but like, yeah, really weird one. And but that was just something as just an ordinary citizen, albeit an ordinary citizen with some like highly useful skills that you contributed, and that, you know, became the basis of all this other stuff. So there is it's a story of like actually how, you know, this is that you don't actually need access to power in some ways or whatever. That was just like you doing some research, wasn't it?
So you have to see like the other angle as well to really understand the difference in the way of acting. The other angle is a journalist who would have some sources, write a story, and then certainly not share what they have with others, right? So there is this very closed approach and very open approach, and the two are in contradiction. But it's also really important to highlight that the open approach was possible here only because there was so much of information already available in the open, like widely available. There wasn't a question of secrecy of sources or very tiny questions there that I could avoid, or even libel, because I could just post links to wherever there was something. So I could write, you know, this person says that, here is a link. And then a journalist would have a lead and be able to assess themselves how reliable it was and everything. And I wasn't concerned about being sued there in doing that, right? So that's that. It's really important.
That's kind of like accounting in a way, I feel, Paul. You know, like there's a thing about this, which is we've got this other project, which is we're trying to do something similar in a way called keeping the receipts. And it's like literally, and this is, you know what, this is a project, we copied it from somebody had done it in the US at the beginning of Trump, which is, and it was taken from, I think it was Timothy Schneider, this thing, which is that you unless you record what is happening in real time, you're not actually even going to be able to start to defend yourself from it. And so in that way of like, I think as Paul sort of says, so much like there's like so much information out there, there's so much which is in the public domain, but it is kind of gathering it, collating it, archiving it, and then kind of storytelling from it.
Yep.
I feel like now we're in flow and we should have booked 2 hours for this. But I fear we have gone over our allotted time.
Yeah.
I really like, thank you very much both for coming. I hope the next time we meet we'd be in the same room with a glass of beer in the hand. We appreciate your time so much. If there's something that you want our audience to kind of consider, contribute to, whatever, just send us the information. We will communicate with everybody afterwards to make sure that they consider that. But Paul and Carole, thank you so much for joining
Thanks very
us
much,
today.
Esco.
Thank
Appreciate
you for
it.
the invitation, and consider signing up for the mailing list of the eyeballs for those who are here and
Eyeballs.
interested.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, we'll do
Thank you.
find a link for that. But merci beaucoup, thank you, Carole,
Bye.
until the next one. And